afternoon, and we are back again. This time we are having two guests. We will be discussing the role of the family, and we are going to have with us a program that we feel can solve many of the problems that we had in our minds. And that we look at this program to bring us light that we have not seen for quite some time. So we're going to deal with Brother Smalls here on my right-hand side, and Sister Santiprika.
Yes.
On my left-hand side. And of course, I am Joseph Ben-Yakan. Brother Smalls, what is your opinion about the ancient African family?
Boy, Dr. Ben, that's a big question. See, here's my opinion. I may be flying all in outer space and stuff. But from my studies, reading a lot of your work, spending a lot of time on the continent talking to a lot of the traditional leadership, the original idea for the family had to do with what we understood of how nature worked. The whole notion of opposites complementing one another, creating a union for a lot of reasons. One, for all the reasons had to do with survival, but one was for protection, one was for mutual support, one was for providing the basic things that was needed, food, clothing, and shelter. And then the other was the understanding of how you did what I think I've heard him call it Pahemiwasu, or the repetition of the birth of the universe, which constantly gets repeated by the human being, giving birth to new life and then cultivating that life that gives birth to new life. And then trying to fuse some understanding into that around the ethical moral principles, which are basic rules and regulations that govern our behavior so that we complement each other and keep harmony and balance. And so my understanding of the family is a constant to keep those things on course, to keep the harmony, to keep the balance, to keep the perpetuation, and to be able to provide food, clothing, shelter, safety, and security for the unit. And that unit gets replicated in larger groupings we call extended families, or the clan, or the tribe, or the nation. Of course, all along the way of history, that gets faltered to the degree that any one of the individuals within any part of the unit is insufficiently tutored or trained in how it should really function.
Santiprika, what is your opinion about family?
My opinion about family is that, I would say in Africa, the children were well behaved, and there was a great deal of respect between children and elders. It's something that we have definitely lost. We've lost our way, obviously due to the influence of the West and the slave trade, and the deliberate splintering of the family. That's not how it used to be, but that's presently where we are at present.
Now, my view of important element in the family. In the West, it's normally conceded that the family is a legal entity in which a marriage is performed. And I am not seeing the family from that point of view. My view of the family is a male, a female, which is the mother and the father, and children resulting therefrom, married or unmarried. The family is based upon that. Then the family is based upon the same arrangement by marriage and children. I find that that eroding of that family has caused the problems that we are having today. Besides that, the family unit cannot succeed as it was yesterday, because yesterday the highest point of the family was childbearing, and the woman played a major role in that. Today she has to go out and work and leave the family exposed. For instance, that the child may not see its mother all day. It may not see its mother till on weekends or different time of arrangement. So the mother is not looked as the prime runner of the family, because she has to compete with the husband for the daily bread. And in that context, I saw the family deteriorating. What do you think about that?
You would pull something on the social. Well, I think that has a lot to do with it. The mother was always the primary educator of the offspring. She gave them their values. She gave them their ethical, moral balance. She transferred the culture. Now you have to put your child in a daycare center, and you really don't have any control over the values that's being transferred, the ethical, moral perspective that the kids are coming into, because they come in contact with all these different individuals from different places with different beliefs and different ideas. Because the society has created such a phenomenon that to earn the medium of exchange, the money, it takes both parents to be working. Both the father and the mother have been removed from traditional roles in training the children and transferring the values and the culture. So I've got 6 kids. They're in their 20s and 30s, and I'm still trying to train them, because having to send them out to schools, I lost a lot of the opportunity. And there were some points where some of my children were my enemies. The enemy of my belief, the enemy of my views, the enemy of their mother's views. They tend to call that rebellion here, but I think it's much worse than rebellion. I think they become the enemy of your belief system, because they've been given a belief system that says yours is wrong, and that they don't have to even adhere to respecting you. And they can still make it in the world without having to give the basic respects. And so that has created a war between the offsprings and the parents. And I think it is deliberate, because the ruling group in this country, I grew up on a plantation in the South, and I worked in the home of the Vanderbilts. They don't raise their children like that. They raise their children more in the African family model. Always a very collective family thing that's constantly going on. The females in the household was constantly the one transferring the culture. The father in that household was the nurturer. And the very things that they were hindering us from doing, they were doing. And as I study the elite in this country, you see them on almost any occasion using the Thanksgiving, Christmas as great opportunities to fuse that family. And even in most of those families, they choose both the bride and the groom for their respective children, or at least have a significant amount to say in the approval. And now if you tell your child the type of individual they need to be dating, you've got a problem. Let alone saying, I'm going to assist in the final decision on whether that person has made up the quality and character necessary for you. So,
Mr. Santiprika, considering what he stated,
Yes.
what do you think about the marriage, and what is your opinion about the rules and regulations and the various prescriptions which we have for the family and marriage?
Well, there are no rules and regulations anymore. That's pretty clear. I can tell you this firsthand when students show up in my classroom in the CUNY system. They're there to learn, but they're lacking just basic manners, certain finesse they're lacking, a certain demeanor they're lacking. That means to me that somebody at home is sitting down on the job. That's what it means. And that means that I have to then teach, as well as attempt to then instill some sort of what we call boundaries. There's no more boundaries between people, what we call boundary issues. They cross them willingly, you know, like they're in your face or whatever. And that's been a problem somewhat. And it's just very, very, it's very distressing to have to deal with, but they learn once they're in my class, and then they go their separate way. But in terms of some sort of redress, someone has to put that in place, so that what you'll have now is a society that's there are two sets of people who will have BA degrees. One set who has manners and so-called sense of self-control, and another set that will have a BA degree, but you know, they just don't care. They cross boundaries and very aggressive. They lack just basic self-containment and self-respect, and they're not getting that at home. And also, there's a phenomenon where parents are cursing at their children. This is a widespread phenomenon, very much so.
In view of what you said, what do you think about the law and the family? The power of the police and coming in and taking over and things like that. Now we could say, call the police for the instruction given by the parents can always be overruled by the police. What do you see in that?
I see it as being a highly dangerous, volatile situation. Now kids can just call 911, but as we saw up here in Harlem, a woman was killed. She had a row or argument with her children. The police came and they killed her, as we recall. I think that was about 6 or 7 years ago. It's very difficult to try to mediate that, because the extended family has broken down to the children are not listening. I think also has a lot to do, to be honest with you, with, and some people may disagree, has a great deal to do with what people are eating, what they're ingesting. You are what you eat, in terms of, let's say, the aggression, the sugar, the antibiotics in the food, all of that, I think, contributes to a state of mind. The media, the influence of television, the profanity in the rap music, all of it contributes to actually youth who are out of control. There's no question about that.
Now, something is amusing. We speak about the role of religion in the home. Now we have the Christian religion, the Muslim religion, the Hebrew religion, and other religions. But primarily, in the United States, the black child generally have a Christian religion. How do you think the other religion forces impact upon us in that relationship, in the family?
I would say that all religions have some sort of moral foundation, and that's really what we should be after. I know myself, I grew up as a Baptist. I'm not sorry that I went. Of course, I kind of wiggled out of it and stopped going as soon as I could, which is around age 12. But I think that religion does have some influence in terms of rules and regulations and things that you must and must not do. Also, I would say this, general kindness and compassion toward other people. I think that's sort of like a given across the board. I think it's very, very important. Even if the child stops going, to have some sort of regularity of some sort of religious practice, whatever it is.
Brother Small.
Well, the religion is probably the most powerful of all of the socializing instruments, because it deals with the fear of death as one of the motivators, and deals with acceptance by the absolute arbiter. That if you're out of God's acceptance, you're in trouble, whatever people perceive that to be. And so it makes religion very powerful. And in a country like this, where Christianity, though you have other religions, Christianity is considered to be the state religion, even though it's not stated that way. The culture is basically a Judeo-Christian culture with primarily a Christian focus. So you don't want to be out of step with that. But something has occurred in this country, like in no other country in the world, where there is an assault, not so much directly on religion, but on the ethical, moral practices or impact on the youth. So you stop prayers in school. And that may seem like a simple thing to say, yeah, we stop prayers because you don't want to be denominational. But then you say that anything that relates to any kind of love and cared about us. Because the final decision is, can I lay my head on this and go to sleep and feel safe and feel comfortable? I mean, my psychological head, my intellectual head, my spiritual head.
Yes.
How can I do this? And the country has been so against African traditional systems being taught. They've spent until you broke the bonds on Egypt. They denied it. That was even an African phenomenon. Matter of fact, they said it wasn't even in Africa until recent years. And so to return to our ancient ways in Egypt, when we were we established the notion of family. We established the notion of society. We established the notion of order. We established the notion of God itself as being necessary to be an arbiter in the situation of humankind. How can we return to that when we have institutions projecting us or forcing us almost to accept these other centers of spiritual centeredness, even though all of the history that relates to those centers and us is abusive? And it's a very hard psychological thing to have to deal with on a daily basis if you're a young person, even though you don't know the details.
I've listened carefully to that explanation. Now come a big question. How can you have a God concept for our people as a whole, and the image of God is displayed in the black churches as being white,
Oh yeah, well that's one of the
and in the holy books as being white,
Yeah.
in the pictures as being white? How do you use that? Don't you see in your text or something, when you refer to God, don't you mean a white person?
Right. Well, I think one of the biggest reasons why most African Americans reject Christianity and Islam, even when they still participate in the rituals. They participate in the rituals because it's a socializing thing. But they reject it in their everyday living habits and behavior. And the reason is they know to accept it is to accept the superiority of white people, first of all, to accept the white man as God, second of all, and those who even pretend to is doing a great damage. Let me see if I can put that in context. When prisoners of war, I think it was during the Second World War, they call it the Helsinki Syndrome. Is it the Helsinki Syndrome? Were prisoners of war who were beaten and tortured. After the torture, psychological torture, and the physical torture got to be so much, they began in their mind to pretend that they were the torturer rather than the torturer. And that way, psychologically, they can reduce the impact of the destruction. African peoples, both on the continent and here, are pretending they're the Europeans. By pretending they're the European, they can partnership with the power and the wealth. So they think.
So
they're not in a real partnership.
Dangerous.
They're still victims of that partnership. One of the most dangerous things in the world is the use of a symbol of another other than yourself as your image for God. But in our case, what makes it more dangerous, you have the symbol of the rapist, the murderer, the genocider of your ancestry as your symbol for God. Somewhere in your subconscious, they know that your conscience is betraying it. And it creates quite a dynamic, as we can see in our people's lives every day.
Well, I need your
Oh
input.
goodness, it takes, I would say, brave teachers to actually help undo it. Again, on a person-by-person basis, one group of people at a time. It's difficult to do it on a mass scale. Although it's true, our people are reading more voraciously than ever before. But let's say just one-on-one, it takes a really good professor or teacher to actually unteach these things. When I teach from the textbook, I splice in the black stuff and actually overturn the European or Eurocentric models regularly in my classrooms. I do that deliberately, and I'm pretty good at it. For instance, they talk about the origins of psychology, but the origins of Western psychology are in fact 100 years old. That's it. So about the, like the late 1800s coming up to the present time, and the so-called notion, even the so-called multicultural or psychology is not even 20 years old. It shows you how little we are thought of by the mainstream. And so basically when you say about even the treatment of psychological disorders, it begins in Egypt. And I teach that in my classroom.
Well, bring this question to a heading. Bishop Man for the AME is given in 1825. He had a conference with 800 African Americans planning to go back to Africa. He had a free boat offered by Delaney, Captain Delaney, who had made trips before, and he was going to furnish all service for that boat free at cost.
Mm-hmm.
Bishop Allen and a number of people met and voted in the night, middle of the night, that they weren't going to Africa and publish their finding in the morning and turn these people around. What do you think of this? That was the beginning of what we call the Association of the Colored Peoples. What do you think about that? What impact that had on society today, if any, in your mind?
Dr. Ma, I'll take a shot at it. Again, the institutions of socialization in this country, the societies of secrets, the churches, the schools, are designed to elevate whites into a position of superiority and to put us, the African people, in a position of inferiority. Mm-hmm. They design it
yes.
so that it makes that statement. Many of our leaders, Allen being one of them, though he's acclaimed as great for walking away from the church, motive is important. He didn't walk away from the church because he saw an African model as being more suited. He walked away from the church because he wasn't given the opportunity to be a part of it in the manner he thought he should be. Mm-hmm. But it isn't that he was rejecting that value system. He wanted to be in that value system. And so I think that move that he made really dealt a blow to the whole movement of Africans realizing themselves as Africans, because we know at that time Martin Delaney was making some very powerful statements. I remember one in 1835 at a meeting with whites, and he says that his house was his castle, and if the President of the United States, he was talking about the slave law, where you could retrieve us and put us back in slavery.
Yes.
He said, if the President of the United States comes to my house with his cabinet as his bodyguard, and the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution as his banner, either I will leave there dead or he will leave there dead, but he will not be allowed to violate that house. So when you have this attitude, talking about going back to Africa, and then you got Allen coming up and diffusing it, you know.
I had most beautiful afternoon with you both, and we have, for instance, right in Palestine today, they said that the Jews are taking away their land. But they came there as foreigners also and took the land. Like they have taken it in other places.
Right.
Like Sudan, Egypt, and places like that.
Morocco.
They don't belong there.
No. And one of the critical things is, and I was also looking, there's a sister named Faye Dunham, Audrey Dunham, who's working on a PhD at Temple. And Audrey is doing a PhD on black nationalism. And her thesis is black nationalism is not a response to white oppression. Black nationalism is an attempt on Africans to exert themselves. And so she's established this quite clearly.
True.
So we were looking at Martin Delaney, we were looking at Garvey, but we were looking at this extraordinary woman, Henrietta Benton Davis.
Oh, God.
Okay.
She was the mother of the organization.
Yes. And most people don't know of her. This woman that worked with Garvey, she spoke 3 or 4 different languages. She was an elocutionist. She was magnificent organizer. She went to Central America with him, to South America with him, up and down the eastern seaboard through the west. And we had such an extraordinary character in our history, and no one knows she ever existed. So what we've been trying to do, some of us, is resurrect some of the unknown activists, male and females, especially from that 1800 period right into the 1940s.
What would you say that the division in the Garvey movement between the women and the men created a thing that is reacting up to now? The women's division only allow secretarial work to the women, and that is existing up to today. For instance, in Cook's organization, you had the women's division won't even allow to participate in certain aspects.
Yeah, true. And a lot of people think that that is African, and that's not.
No,
that's
it's not
very
African.
European. And in Africa, for as far back as we can go, we've had female heads of states.
Yeah.
We've had females in all categories of society.
Right.
And you just have to look at the literature, even the oral literature, and even today in the traditional societies that we can visit, that's intact. And the women do not have a diminished role. But right in Africa now, if you go into the urban setting, where they've been acculturated in British French culture, they have diminished the woman's role in society.
Right.
And because people see the aesthetic of Africa there, they think that's an African phenomenon, and it's not. And so we've got to be very careful not allowing African aesthetics to fool us on what is substantively African values and African worldview. And I think what was occurring at the time that Delaney, and then right into a man who people know very little, T. Thomas Fortune, who became the editor of Garvey's newspaper.
Right.
But he used to work with Booker Washington before and helped found something called the Afro-American League in 1892. Okay, and that the Afro-American League, the Boys was a part of that and took that constitution with them into the Niagara movement and into the NACP.
No. Now that you've gone that much into the African past, I would say back in 1800s, with the proclamation of Thomas Fortune and all of the men who went along with the movement by Richard Allen, the revolution, you could say, of the church, why you would think that those men, though moving from their position in the church, having to sit up in the balcony, came back and built a system exactly the
like
same.
What they were trying to get away from.
You might mention who Richard Allen was?
Richard Allen was a man, the first member, first bishop of the Protestant church, the AME church. And
Down on Wall Street, the first church.
Yes, and he was forced to sit in the balcony in the white church. He could not sit downstairs, and he tried many times to get that position. And eventually, he left the white church and founded the African Methodist Episcopal Church,
Which is on 139th
Each
Street.
of them are various places today, and they're exact duplicate of the white church.
Well, I think for the same reason that we have the problem today, because we don't have access to African models, African institutional models, and we're just beginning to get the kind of data necessary. The degree to which African institutional models did exist, especially on the plantations in the South, like my grandma, who was a root woman, I grew up in the root tradition. I grew up in the bush, you know, where we were root people. It still is a root man, you know what I'm saying? That tradition was so frowned upon and looked down upon by the intellectuals and those who had been socialized by a white middle class and upper class society that they never even thought of that as a model.
Legitimacy, that was the
Right,
issue.
it didn't have any legitimacy as a social model or a spiritual model. So they took the spiritual models they had And the only value system that they had, because they were acculturated and socialized, is white people.
That's true.
And so we are talking really, and I know some people get angry, but we are talking about white people in blackface trying to forge their notion of freedom in a society where the concept of freedom that was available to use did not apply to them. And so every effort we took seemed to just mire us deeper and deeper into submission and
Yes.
imitation
Yes.
of white society.
Yes.
If that is so, the effect of the church going back to Mother Africa, Liberia to be exact, the role of the church, the black church, was the same as the white church in preaching to the people
Right.
the myth of the Christian religion, Jesus born of a virgin, and so on.
It
What
became,
effect it had?
it became a colonizer, a mental and a spiritual colonizer. And as it manifests itself in Liberia particularly, but we know they had established one in Ghana, they had established one in Nigeria, they had established one in South Africa, and this is before the turn of the century. And they were there primarily to civilize the Africans. This is the African American Christian viewing themselves as a civilizing agent,
Right.
but using the same institution that was used to keep him in a deprivated state psychologically, intellectually, and spiritually. And I'm saying just as now and then, we believed because through fear and intimidation at the deepest psychic level, we cannot reach out to an African institutional model. We can see it now as we've learned more about Egypt. There's African institutional models for our spiritual perspective. We can see it in the Yoruba tradition. We can see it in the Akan tradition. And even many times when people move into that, those traditions, they take the Christian format with them.
Yep.
And so we have to really, and I think Sister was talking about how she spliced our stuff in between, we have to really talk about how do we begin to construct institutions for socialization purposes. That is fundamentally African, and my take on that is that it has to come exclusively out of our ancestral experience in order for that to happen.
With the black church and with Ethiopia having the oldest form of Christianity, the Coptic Church, why would you assume that for years in and years out, the black people did not adopt the Coptic religion?
You wanna
That's
do
a
it?
That's a heavy.
That's a very heavy one.
Woo.
I don't know if I can really answer that question. I would say there's a lot of misrepresentation. You say in the Coptic Church, as you know, all throughout Europe there's the black Madonna. Even that didn't save it, and they turned all the Madonnas and of course Jesus white. You know. And
Say
it's-
that again slowly, please.
What I'm saying is that all over Europe there is a phenomenon of the Black Madonna. But by the time they got to us, I'm sure they had changed all the Jesus and Madonna's white. And so that's some of the difficulty in terms of, in other words, literally something being lost in the translation. That's a big part of it. And
Well, why do you feel that at present the Catholic Church is given the tendency to also use a white Jesus now? The Ethiopian Church, Jesus is now starting to be presented as white in many places, and the Ethiopian Bible have 2 books more than the Western Christian Bible. And the Ethiopian Church became the first national church. The first nation to have a national church was Ethiopia. There's lots of arguments if the people, the people that have Unyanan is the name. The name in that with a IAN. They popular in jewelry. Yeah. What? I knew what the name of the people are. Armenians. The Armenians. I give them credit for being the first, having the first national church, but it was the Ethiopians.
Of course.
And Azuma was the king who converted to Christianity and made his entire cabinet, and thus became the first Christian church. Well, why do you feel that the Coptic movement didn't grow among the African Americans?
Well, we know that at that same period in the 1800s, we had a heavy Ethiopian movement developing in this country. And we saw at the turn of the century the evolution of the Hebrew Israelite movement coming from some of those people. We saw even the evolution of Drew Ali and the Moorish Science Temple coming out of some of that movement. And some Ethiopian churches have survived to this day. But I think the reason we didn't go, because the one thing African Americans, and I guess when you blind and think you can see, you really don't know you're blind. I think the healers, those who, and healers I mean by historians and scientists and others who have tried to enlighten themselves, haven't really addressed the problem that labels is not deep enough for self-identity. So we've been satisfied with just saying, I'm African American, I'm black. Those are labels, but what package should be behind the label?
What's underneath?
Right, and we haven't really addressed to the construction of personality construction, value system, interest, principles,
Reconstruction.
world, right, reconstruction.
Of the mind.
And then there have to be a deconstruction before the reconstruction, and we haven't really undertaken that. So most black folks, since, let me just back up a minute, most religions today, we call them religions. But in the founding, they were state ideology, okay? These state ideologies have taken a peripheral position, but a supporting position to new material ideologies like capitalism and socialism.
Wait, no. Now that you have said all that, you know Ilombe Brad.
Yes.
Yes.
His movement sponsored a certain tradition among African women, the Grandiosa models. These African women were proud of their hair,
Yes.
proud of their body, and perpetuated, trained it. Natural hair,
Yes.
no hair, no hot, not comb or no straightening or nothing like that. Why do you feel that that failed to exist today?
Because we failed, I think those of us in the 60s, then I'm going to let it come back.
I don't know about that. I don't know if I agree with that at all.
Never heard that.
No.
I think it doesn't have the broad spread appeal, because when we in the 60s was fighting to perpetuate that movement, and I appreciate the Grandiosa, they just don't know. When I grew up, everybody wore their hair in that fashion. I grew up on a plantation. You couldn't work in the fields in those streets.
Yeah, right.
Hair.
Yes.
And we had our hair cornbread and all this stuff.
Right.
But as a social statement, to make a statement on how we feel about that, they were certainly the pioneers. But the system of oppression in America, using their media and their education, went on the attack. And the attack was to give us, to first denigrate that image, but then to give us role models after they established that phenomenon, especially using TV and movies, that did just the opposite of the African image. So if someone who straightened their hair, conduct themselves like a white person, dressed like a white man, can be successful, and the images we constantly get of those who try to be natural or revolutionary is unsuccessful and losing, pretty soon you're going to make a choice of which one of those you want to be. And the young people begin to make a choice that nationalist revolutionary stuff ain't getting me nowhere, and wearing that old nappy hair ain't getting me nowhere. And it's not, I know that's an oversimplification, but there was and there's still a big attempt around aesthetics and history on the part of the system to make sure that aesthetics, their aesthetics, is what is considered to be the standard for beauty in the society. African aesthetics It's
That
always
being
in
so,
some way.
that being so,
But Sister wanted to make a comment on that, and I think she can.
That's-
Brother, Professor Smalls, I respectfully take the issue with it. I think that the hair in the 60s, if I may really speak to that, is from a psychological viewpoint, it really means that the sort of a pushing out of the mind. That's how I see that. Hence, the hair gets longer and longer, so to speak. And I think that what we have now is the advent in the 70s. Is it the 70s or the 80s? With the brother who founded Kidnaps. Kidnaps set the tone and the model. Now people wear their hair any which way. They wear it twisted, they wear it braided, and they are, to me, that's part of the acceptance of the black self. Now, some of the problem, of course, is that people who wear some of these twists and braids cannot be trusted. That means they have not done the inner psychological work. They have borrowed from the 60s and from the 70s without doing the inner work. So you never know who you're talking to. Yeah, that's the problem. And some people with straight hair, I trust them absolutely because they're warm, they're good people, they're trying to be decent, and they're coming from the right place. And some people you just don't know. But I'll just say this: I appreciate, you say aesthetic, I appreciate very much this Afrocentric aesthetic, and that's an issue in itself, Afrocentrism. But I like it. It's nice on my eyes. I appreciate
Well,
it.
the reason I say
And the
I
shame,
dealt
and
with
the issue is the shame is not there anymore. That's the part I really like. And that's what that pushing out with the afro out to here, that's what that was about. It was about the erasure of shame.
right.
That's really what that
But
meant.
what I'm saying is that process is being reversed. And even where we see people wearing the extensions that the Senegalese and others on the unpunished making good money off of, if you watch body language and how the movements that's dealing with, you're not talking about an emulation of any African aesthetics.
Right.
You're talking about, yes, I can look enough African so that I'm perceived not to be in betrayal, but I can have enough of the aesthetics of the European that I can seem not to be in opposition. And so, and that's not true for everybody.
Toned down somewhat, is that what you mean?
Right, and what I'm saying is that the aesthetics is important enough, and media show us that aesthetics is important enough because that's the first thing that's signaling the minds to identify the object. And so aesthetic is important enough that they've declared war on the African aesthetics. Now some of us have survived it, and like you say, even people who have straight hair can be more African focused than someone who have a natural hair.
Absolutely.
That's why I use the word aesthetics and not talking about the personality or qualities, because we know that. But I'm saying the importance of aesthetics in signaling things to the human mind.
I mean, it's too
is
stylized.
significant.
Do you really mean it's too stylized? Is that
No,
what you mean?
I mean there have been a
appearance?
kind of a media here, but in those rap is the same African rhythmic pattern
Yes.
that we hear in the drums and the music of Africa,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
with
It's free to the air to be taken.
having said that,
Yes, Dr. Ben.
our next sitting, we will discuss this much further, but right now we have to wrap it up and find another means of expressing ourselves.
Yes.
And we want to say, we wish you good luck
Good luck.
and see you again. And we try
Thank you,
and
Dr. Ben.
move the meeting back to the moderator.
Yes, sir.
We assemble to give you thanks for one of your faithful servants. We thank you for his life. We thank you for his memory. We thank you for the families that are gathered and all the friends who have come to share this celebration of life. Bless us now, O God, with the presence of thine Holy Spirit, that we might know the meaning of life and understand the mystery of death. We know that our brother watches over us. He joins with the other ancestors. And all of us are the better because he lived, because he shared of his wisdom, but most of all his love. May your peace be in this place today. And may those who speak, speak not from their own thoughts, but from the thoughts that you give them. May they speak not from their own wills, but from the will of you, O God. And this sacred place, which houses the ceremony, may it continue to be a place where our community can gather in love and in peace, and with a certain assurance that our struggle continues and that we will be free someday. Now hear our prayer, O God. Incline thine ear to us and grant us thy peace. Amen. Now we ask Amy Peterson-Crew to sing for us His Eye is on the Sparrow.